Principles of Macroeconomics, Chapter 12, The Keynesian Perspective, Professor Wagner. In this chapter, we're going to talk about some of the concepts created by Maynard Keynes, a very famous economist that came back from the 20s and 30s. Basically thought that government basically drove the economy. We'll talk about the various things like aggregate demand, the building blocks of Keynesian analysis, the Phillips Curve, and the perspective on market forces. In the 30s, we had the Great Depression, and in 2008, we had something called the Great Recession. I think most of us have actually lived through this, either while we were still in grammar school or later on, but just the same, it was the last serious financial bubble that popped. So many businesses closed, foreclosures, were pretty much rampant. The whole housing bubble, the whole housing industry, was sacked. So were a number of large banks. It was all pretty much done as a result of dishonest packaging of loans being sold, back and forth amongst the banks. So this is a look at the U.S. GDP from 1930 to 2014, and you can see the change in percent in GDP since 1930. 1929 is when the market crashed, but from 1930, it was already at negative 8% growth, and we were down to negative 20% growth nearly at the absolute bottom, which was about 1932 when all the banks collapsed. And then it started digging its way out due to programs implemented by FDR. And so the magnitude of both recessions and peaks was quite large between 1930 and 45. This period here was, kind of a bounce back to recovery. We sank back down to a slow growth period here. This is World War II. And then with the post-war years thereafter, pretty much fueled by the Cold War and the industrial military complex, and actually just a good stable growth pattern in terms of things industry. Aggregate demand in Keynesian analysis, the perspective focuses on the idea that firms produce output only if they expect it to sell, which is pretty common sense. It's very intuitive. Real GDP, definition, amount of goods and services actually sold. Keynes argued that demand is not stable, that it can change unexpectedly. Recessionary gap is the equilibrium at a level below output potential GDP, and inflationary is an equilibrium at a level of output above the GDP. The Keynesian view of aggregate demand, aggregate supply model uses a short-run aggregate supply curve, which is horizontal at levels of output below, output below potential, and vertical at potential output. So you have here, he's speaking to this line, and he's speaking to this line here. Thus, when beginning of potential output, any decrease in aggregate demand affects only output but not necessarily prices. Any increase in aggregate demand affects only prices but not output. Consumption expenditure is a term. It basically means how households spend their money on durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. Durable goods are defined as goods lasting greater than a year, so cars would be considered durable goods. Non-durable goods would be things that you expect to throw away after use, and services self-explanatory. Disposable income, which is income after taxes, expected future income, and wealth credit are the features that Keynes felt that affected consumption. So things that determine investment expenditure. So spending on new capital goods is considered investment expenditure. This typically is something that businesses will do. It also, it could be, also called sunken cost in some cases where they're going to spend the money. They may not really ever see it back unless it pays for itself over its use over the long term. Produces durable equipment and software, non-residential structures such as factory offices and retail locations, changes in inventories and residential structures. These are the four categories. And when a business decides to make an investment in physical, tangible assets, the firm considers both the expected investment benefits and investment costs. So basically, they're looking at future profit expectations and the cost for them in terms of borrowing money, interest rates. The determinants of government spending. Federal, state, and local governments spend money on public services such as national defense, transportation, infrastructure, and education. That the national defense is probably a bit more at the federal level. Keynes recognized that the government budget offered a powerful tool for influencing aggregate demand. More government spending could stimulate aggregate demand, or less government could actually reduce it. And lower raising taxes had a similar effect. It could influence consumption or investment spending, meaning that lower taxes, people are incented to spend more money. And then when taxes are raised, people tend to save more. Keynes concluded during extreme times like the deep recessions, only government had the power and resources to move aggregate demand. I would say in recent times, because of the stimulus packages in 2008, you may have heard of QE, or quantitative easing. That's where we increase the money supply and reduce the basis lending rate from the Federal Reserve to nearly zero or zero to stimulate economic activity. It did have some impact. That's actually what's being done right now at this very moment with the COVID crisis. And so it's government acting to try and revive the economy. What determines net exports? So we talk about aggregate demand and spending on domestic goods and services. Export expenditures add to AD, while import expenditures subtract from AD. So these are the impacts that imports and exports have on aggregate demand. Two sets of factors can cause shifts in export and import demand, changes in relative growth rates between countries, also the change in relative prices between countries. This is something we've been grappling with as of late in terms of trade relations with other nations. We recently had closed a package deal with Canada and Mexico. It replaced NAFTA, and with the belief that the new trade relations, as they were outlined in that particular agreement, brought more parity to the situation where trade was more fair amongst the countries. We also had a tariff situation with China, which still pretty well exists. Those relations aren't really as good as they once were. However, there were a lot of activities that the Chinese engaged in to cause this to happen. The agreement was most definitely too one-sided, and so the government's attempt to put tariffs on was only to try and bring parity back into the trade situation where it wasn't so one way. Keynesian economics focuses on explaining why recessions and depressions occur and offering a policy prescription for minimizing their effects. So these are part of the building blocks of Keynesian analysis. And so the view of recession is built on two blocks. Aggregate demand isn't automatically high enough to provide firms with an incentive to hire enough workers to reach full employment. And the macro economy may only adjust slowly to shift. So there's a stickiness, once again, in the change from one state to another in aggregate demand because of sticky wages of prices. I guess I just said that. Sticky wages of prices is where they do not respond immediately to some kind of change in aggregate demand. Going further on wage and price stickiness, Keynes pointed out although AD fluctuated, aggregate demand, prices and wages did not immediately respond as economists often expected. Instead, wages and prices are sticky, making it difficult to restore the economy to full employment and potential GDP. It is just simply people, okay, so they changed, they changed policy or they changed something to influence to influence the aggregate demand, but the participants in the economy say, well, we're not really sure how long this is going to last, so they delay for one reason or another, usually just due to uncertainty as to whether they're going to make any changes in wage or prices. Coordination argument, downward wage and price flexibility requires perfect information, which we almost never have, about the level of lower compensation acceptable to other laborers and market participants. More on wage and price stickiness. A modern economists argued along with wages and other prices may be sticky too. When a firm considers changing prices, it also has to consider two sets of costs. Changing prices uses company resources, and the frequent price changes may leave customers confused and angry. So that's causation of the stickiness. Menu cost, firms face in changing prices. Sticky prices and falling demand in the labor and goods market. So there's an illustration in both A and B. Demand curve shifts left from D0 to D1. However, the wage in A and the price in B do not immediately decline. In A, the demanded labor for the original wage is Q0, with the new demand for curve labor D1 will be Q1. So there'll be a shift to the left. And then similarly in B, the same thing would happen with the price, going from at P0, the original demand is Q0, but that changes to now Q1 right over here. So it goes from here to there, same thing from here to there. The fall in demand in the labor market and goods continued. An excess labor supply will exist. We'll call that unemployment. And an excess supply of goods will also exist. So that's where quantity demanded is substantially less than what's being supplied. Thus, sticky wages and prices combined with a drop in demand bring about unemployment and recession. So he's talking about a causation. Jobs lost or gained in the recession recovery. And so there's two graphs. Why is the pace of wage adjustment slow? And why is the data in the charts above suggest about job lost, gained, and since the Great Recession in the U.S. So they're talking about the 2008. And here you see that lower wage occupations comprise 21%. 19% or higher wages, and then there's the middle ground. And then when jobs, recover in the economy, when there's more jobs available and more competition for labor, higher wage occupations comprise 20%, mid-wage shrinks to 22%, and lower wage occupations comprise 58%. So what's occurred in this particular situation is that the lower wages, lose out in comparison to these, where the middle gets, chopped out in the recession. During the recovery, these jobs start to dwindle. During a recession, these jobs begin to dwindle. Perspective of a recession. So you have two key assumptions behind economics. A recession begins when the aggregate demand goes from AD to 81, 80. So once again, when it goes from here to there, that's illustrates the recession. Similarly, we fix a certain price at any given price. When the aggregate demand shifts to the left, we have an equilibrium here, so we have an output of y of p. That changes to y of 1 when a recession occurs. So the demand, for the goods simply shrinks, or shifts left in this case. Okay, the expenditure multiplier. These are things you probably see in the test, so you want to know what a macroeconomic externality is, and basically that's what happens. That's something that happens to cause things to change, external from the normal macroeconomic activity. The expenditure multiplier is a concept that asserts that autonomous spending causes a more than proportionate change in the real GDP. So the idea that not only does spending affect the equilibrium of the level of the GDP, but that spending is powerful. So the change in output divided by the change in spending greater than 1. The reason for the expenditure multiplier is a person's spending becomes another person's income, which leads to additional spending and additional income. The Phillips curve, is the trade-off between unemployment and inflation. So once again, we talk about the aggregate demand, a Keynesian curve here, and then we have the intermediate zone and the neoclassical zone, our long-run aggregate supply versus our short-run aggregate supply. On this slide, the Keynesian Phillips curve trade-off between unemployment and inflation. So these are its traits. It illustrates a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. If one's higher, the other must be lower, so it's directly proportional. For example, if point A illustrates a 5% inflation rate and a 4% unemployment rate, then B will represent an inflation rate of 2, but an unemployment rate of 7. This is a Phillips curve represented as a scattered plot. However, if you'll notice that indeed, if you were to do a regression, there would be a curve that follows like that. And so it shows the relationship between employment and unemployment and inflation. A trade-off between unemployment appeared to break down during the 1970s as the curve shifted out to the right. So you might not really see it quite visibly, but this is the Phillips curve. So we can call that P of 0. And you'll notice there's a pattern here as well. That would be P of 1. So what they're saying is this shifted to there in the 1970s, which is an anomalous activity. It's something that's unusual. Okay, Keynesian policy techniques for fighting unemployment and inflation. So, tools used in the toolbox include expansionary fiscal policy. So that could be tax cuts, it could be quantitative easing, changing of the Fed discount rate. A number of things, can contribute to that. And then contractionary fiscal policy when the government when the macroeconomy is a little bit too hot and it starts becoming inflationary, increase taxes or cut government spending, designed to decrease the aggregate demand and reduce inflationary pressures. And when I speak to an economy getting hot, this is the term inflationary pressures. When the economy runs a little too good, the cost of goods, starts spiraling upward out of proportion to the rest of the economy. Also, fighting recession and inflation with Keynesian policy. If the economy is in recession with an equilibrium of E of R, which would be here, then the Keynesian response would be an active policy to shift the demand to the right. So it would shift the AD curve over to here to the right, and you would come up with more output and higher prices. Keynesian perspective of market forces. It is controversial over the extent to which government should play an active role in managing the economy. Some supporters of Keynesian economics advocate a high degree of government planning in all parts of the economy. However, Keynes was careful to separate the issue of aggregate demand from the issue of how well an individual's market worked. The opposite of Keynesian would be, you probably may have heard the term supply side, which is really the government staying out of the marketplace or the economy and let the free forces of market economics, pretty much decide which direction things were going to head and how they repair themselves and whatnot. Kind of Darwinian, but so at times quite effective. A couple other points he argued on market forces. He said the individual markets for goods and services were appropriate and useful, but sometimes that level of aggregate demand was just too low. He also believed that while government should ensure the overall aggregate demand is sufficient for an economy to reach full employment, this task did not imply that the government should attempt to set prices and wages or take over or manage large corporations directly. So a lot of people will sometimes say Keynesian was neo-socialist in terms of his ideology or his view to economics, but in truth, really not. This is the end of chapter 12.